Hi, and thanks for joining us for this installment of the Aga Khan Museum's Reimagined Global Conversations series. My name is Michael Chagnon. I'm a curator at the museum. And today I'm joined by two brilliant and prolific interlocutors, both teachers, both researchers, and both artists, Ranu Mukherjee and Azra Akšamija. Welcome to you both.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Both Ranu and Azra played key roles in the current Aga Khan Museum special exhibition, Sanctuary, which broadly explores the theme of sanctuary in an age marked by displacement through 36 woven carpets designed by some of the world's leading contemporary artists. Ranu's contribution to the exhibition, a carpet titled Begin, has a special relevance to the theme of sanctuary and migration in Canada, while Azra designed the exhibition's stunning and environmentally sustainable architecture. I'm not going to read full bios for both of you. We'll post those in the description because you are so prolific that I think we would end up taking up the entire session to describe all of your achievements. But I wanted just to say that both of you work within a practice that really foregrounds in a lot of ways the themes of displacement and sanctuary that are central to the exhibition. So I wanted to start the conversation with a question that requires a little bit of a preamble, and that's about the exhibition itself. The exhibition was originated in San Francisco in 2016-2017 by the Foresight Foundation. And it came at a time when migration and displacement were themes that were really at the forefront of global concern at the time, both in terms of ongoing conflicts in places like Syria, but also migration along the southern border of the United States. But since it was restructured beginning in 2019 for the Aga Khan Museum presentation, and even in the past several months, obviously a lot has changed, including most prominently the COVID crisis. And yet the exhibition's relevance continues to expand. I think it's not a this or that. I think that there's continued relevance for the exhibition even in this time, and we can see these deeper connections. So I guess I wanted to ask a question about that. Where do you see the COVID crisis that we're experiencing globally intersecting with the themes of migration and displacement that are both at the core of the exhibition and your practice? It's a big question. And I would love for the both of you to speak a little bit about that. Ranu, would you like to start?
Sure. Well, I think that COVID has brought up a very clear picture of structural violence and structural inequity. And I feel like, so the displaced also have the people who are displaced right now that don't have homes are, at way more risk. And then I think that there's this other layer where we're all sort of displaced within our own homes. So everyone's experiencing some kind of displacement, but it's very unevenly distributed. And I'm thinking, of course, about the people who are still on the border of the United States. Some of them in cages. So there's people who are in prisons. So there's all kinds of I feel like it's bringing up this sort of structural violence in terms of our systems. I also have a lot of family in India. So I'm thinking about the way that, when COVID first happened, people had to leave the cities because all of the temporary work disappeared. And so those people were on these really long journeys back to villages in different parts of the country. And there was a lot of death, not from COVID, but from the difficulty of the migration and from hunger and from things like that. So yeah, that's the way I guess I see the dialogue kind of moving on, or the reality of the displaced becoming more difficult in this situation. And then, people not really having access to the kinds of parameters that we're all supposed to be following, right? Clean water, washing hands, like all of these really basic things are not equally accessible.
Right. And Azra, I suppose the same question.
Yes, absolutely agree with what Ranu is saying. And maybe to add to that, I think the pandemic has shown also kind of vulnerabilities of us as a global community, those who were not only that we have become displaced from our lives, but those who were displaced before, like refugees, an increasing number, which is going to be even more exaggerated by the pandemic, have become even more vulnerable. And to me, this latest crisis just really put to light the kind of interconnectedness and fragility of our planet and our global community. And that's, I think, everyone is affected, whether you are an artist and museum worker, or someone who is living in Toronto and wants to access this, but then someone on another part of the world who maybe we are trying to talk about and bring into the conversation, like those refugees that I collaborate with from Syria, whose work and inventions are presented in the exhibition.
Right. And I suppose you've begun to touch on it, and Ranu, I want to come back to you as well now. Where do you see the arts playing a role in these intersecting nodes? And that's a question I'll return to at the end, but I'm wondering, as an artist, as a working artist, as someone who's working in an art, as the head of the filmmaking department at your university, where do you see the arts playing a role in this right now?
I think we're at a point historically everywhere globally where we have to reimagine a lot of things and a lot of systems. And I feel like the arts are really, like, kind of in a way the best context for that. And in some ways, I think in every field there are opportunities for this, but I think that as a field that operates specifically around opening up new ways of imagining the world, I think that that's sort of a primary mode. Like, we may not be first responders in a very obvious health-oriented way, but I think that in terms of making artwork that deals with the fact that we need to imagine differently, maybe we need to see differently, maybe different voices need to be heard. There's a space for there can be a space if we move in that direction for different voices. And also, for me, the thing I've been thinking about the most is that just related to the notion of vulnerability and displacement and conditions that force us to restructure our lives. I feel like often the people who have done this the most are deemed as victims, but I'm really interested in the idea of them being considered as experts. Mm-hmm. So that's one of the things I've been thinking about in my own work, is to how to understand that we're becoming experts in vulnerability, and that these kinds of ruptures are likely to continue. So I feel like the arts are a really good sort of testing ground for thinking about how to move forward, but also how to imagine our world differently.
I think you bring up something really interesting that I think ties your practice with Azra's, and that is this notion of working with others. So working in a sense with, the sort of collaborative model, let's say, by bringing voices that haven't been heard, by bringing those voices out, and using art as a platform for that. It's very much, I think, what you were describing now, as well as the work that Azra alluded to just before we turned the question over to you, which is Azra's work at the Azra refugee camp in Jordan. And so that's actually, that wasn't a question that I had anticipated, but I'm wondering if you can both talk a little bit about that, that kind of practice, how that sort of alters, how that has changed in the current time, and and speak a little bit more about its relevance today. It's a very different kind of form of art making than I think people who traditionally go to museums expect. So I think it's interesting to think about it in the current circumstances.
Yes, I think even before the pandemic started, the so-called art world, and there are many of these, and our field has been witnessing a kind of crisis of, let's say, meaning or relevance. I mean, you have, different kinds of art worlds, from art as a kind of commodity and investment, to art as an intellectual enterprise and educational vehicle, to art as a kind of social critique and intervention. And I think here we are witnessing now a transformation and a kind of resurfacing of the more need for these socially and politically engaged practices to have a voice, help us imagine a better future. We are bombarded by news that are quite depressing of the reality of our globe. And we have been witnessing a kind of loss of empathy and ignorance to the suffering of others. And I think here artists can play a really crucial role of, on the one hand, kind of seeing things with different eyes and making them visible, providing a platform or a voice, a possibility to connect also across borders, providing a possibility for those who are marginalized and left out from certain narratives and themes to get a voice or get a format to speak. So there are many exciting opportunities, and we see this transformation already happening in so many institutions. I mean, the Black Lives Matter movement has actually produced serious conversations, at least in our university, with students. We have never had such strong vocal proponents of systemic change that are coming from the students, but also driven also from the professors. And I think it's also really exciting that actually things are happening and moving, that things that artists have been kind of pointing and talking to, but they are now part of this conversation and this change. At the same time, we also see that museums are shutting down. There's some forced to sell artworks to survive. So this kind of commodity dimension is still luring above us. And I hope that the important work that cultural workers are doing will also be supported by their respective governments.
I think a lot of the voices that are happening collectively around mutual aid and interdependence and different kinds of self-care are really inspiring, and also just pushing institutions to, reckon with inequities. But there's like a working together on that level, which is different, another level than making an artwork per se, but those kinds of processes are really connected. I think that, like, for me, there's also been a big change during COVID, because I work in both ways. So for me, it's really important to sort of hole up in my studio and be solo. But I also work on these more collective projects. And the one that I've been planning, which really relates to all of the topics that we're talking about today, is called Ensemble for Nonlinear Time. And it's a project where I wanted to bring together people who were sort of resettled refugees and people from the communities that have been affected by the fires in California, because I'm really thinking a lot about the overlay between environmental change and migration. And I think of migration as a sort of positive force in certain ways, because I think that the people who migrate add a lot to the places that they go to, and this kind of shift that I'm a real Octavia Butler fan, and I agree with the God is change thing in all of her work. I've been thinking about that every day since this started, because she kind of predicted all of this. But this project that I wanted to work on was to kind of bring together people that are also considered like this international other, and people who are considered sort of local and belonging in California, and sort of try to make a work where we are imagining the future. So thinking about them as visionaries and experts, and working through a series of prompts. And so it starts with a workshop that I'm collaborating with Hope More Dance. So I'm also trying to kind of move out of like work with this sort of overlay between somatic and visual knowledge, and overlay those things. So bringing the dance element into it, and so bringing together an ensemble of people to collectively think about how we imagine the future is sort of the way that I wanted to start to work on my more collective side of my practice. And I haven't been able to I've started to do it. We had a workshop planned for last weekend, and we were going to do an outdoor, socially distanced, small workshop to start this project. I think this project is probably like one of those 5 or 10 year projects, but even that we had to postpone it till October 4th because of the fires. So and we're working with an organization called Art Together that's in Oakland, who works with refugee artists who are from refugee and immigrant backgrounds. And so, I was very specifically trying to put this overlay together. And then of course the world does it first. And so I feel like that is kind of also the nature of this time, and the lesson of this time, is that we also have to work with all of these non-human forces, and that our conversation with them is part of the work in some kind of way.
It's interesting. You hit on this point that I think everyone is experiencing, that we are seeing such a convergence of so many issues all at the same time, that I've had some conversations where I've been trying to think about, how do museums navigate this? What is the next step? How are artists working during these times, and does that change things irrevocably? Is this going to be just a blip in the history books? It just seems more monumental than that, right? Because we're so upended. But no matter what the outcome is, I think it's very important for artists and for museums to sort of be historians in a sense. I'm trained as a historian, so this is where my brain always goes, but we have to keep this story. We have to record this story, because I think it's perhaps, at least in our lifetimes, the most illustrative moment of such an overlay and such a convergence of so many things that face us all globally and unite us all through sort of crisis globally. It's a really interesting moment, and how the arts sort of intersects and digests that is, I think, very interesting. And I think, you've both spoken about how your practices really, really touch on all of that. I'm going to ask you, Ranu, to send us any sort of image that you may have for this project. If you have any sort of picture of anyone coming together, anything, a plan, I would love to be able to show that in the final version.
Yeah, I'd love to send you the prompts, because what I've realized is that, I'm gonna participate in this workshop myself with the participants, so I won't just be a leader. But the prompts, like my idea about this population of refugee immigrant people, and then this population of people who've been impacted by the fires, it's starting to feel like okay, does it need to be that specific? Aren't these prompts kind of applicable to everyone, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And as I go ahead with the project with this focus, it's such a wide focus anyway. I mean, it's not like a specific demographic or anything like that. So I'm really thinking about having to do these prompts on myself, and while when I can't, during the time that I can't gather. But I will send you the prompts because I think they're worth, worth thinking about in themselves.
Excellent. I think we'll be able to, even if it's just a PDF, we can show some of the prompts on in the video itself. I'm going to turn to Azra for a second, because you mentioned your work in the Azra refugee camp. At the end of the Sanctuary exhibition, of course, we've included an installation of 11 photographs that you've taken at the camp, showing the work that you've done with those who live there, in sort of creating, using materials at hand to create culture, to create sort of ways of living in these places that are enhanced. And you've worked many years with those who live in the camp. I'm wondering if you could tell us more about that work and how it's changed. Have you been in touch with the people who live there? I know you worked with them, with your students for many years. What's it like right now in the current circumstances?
It's pretty tough. So, just to give some context, so since 2016, my laboratory researchers and my students and I have been going in and out to Jordan for like every 2 months approximately. It's a large group of people with Jordanian colleagues and a larger group of Syrian refugees, and we worked in 2 camps. What's presented in the exhibition is the work from the Azra refugee camp, but we also worked in Zaatari, and our work in Zaatari is what inspired the architecture of the exhibition at the Aga Khan Museum with the textile work. So what is shown in the exhibition, inventions by refugees that we jointly documented with people who made them. To do that, I mean, it was a whole process of like discovering how to ethically do stuff, not just to kind of teleport yourself from the US and be the white savior and kind of exoticize these things, but really to create some form of conversation and exchange of ideas and knowledge across borders. And so the photographs were taken by youth groups of refugees who run this journal, like they initiated the journal. And we supported their work through different kinds of workshops and creative writing, photography, and also interviews with the inventors. But like every step had to be done in a way that it was done together with groups that could exchange, rather than we go to study them. And so in a way, what we learned from these inventions is that how people in the moments of existential minimum and threat transform, a kind of an impossible condition of encampment. I mean, they're literally in a prison, into a livable environment and a kind of create life worth living. It's just amazing to me. And this is something that kind of hits the core of why art, design, culture matters. It's not about necessarily troubleshooting the awful architecture of the humanitarian aid. And if we think that this is the best we can do, then we are all in big trouble, because the state of humanitarian design is pretty catastrophic, as you will see in these images. But then these people like humanize this humanitarian aid by sourcing their own cultural practices and heritage and inventiveness to, just create dignity, create a link to history where they come from. There is this, apropos sanctuary, right? You have a shelter that is provided by the UNHCR, and then in the foreground you have a replica of Palmyra arch made of mud that someone was doing with mud, and he was stealing a little bit of a cement from different construction sites because they are not allowed to bring cement in. not to become permanent there. And so for me, this photograph is one of these kind of the juxtaposition of what we as system of a kind of humanitarian aid and think that is a shelter, this standardized, industrialized solution, one fits all, which is made of steel. And then this cultural shelter in front of it that this person built, which is just so amazing. And so, you know, we learn from these things, and with my students, then we basically documented and reverse engineered these drawings so that they actually get a kind of, understood in terms of the inventiveness, and also to be able to be shared as knowledge to other people in the camp, to humanitarian providers, aid providers, to people working across art and design. And you know, we were planning to go in the spring and in the fall. We are doing a range of new projects which are based on like using recycled textiles, humanitarian aid textiles, and clothes that they get. I mean, they get trash from all over the world. Everyone just gives them their clothes, which is partly completely culturally inappropriate, like skinny, tight jeans for a Muslim woman from Syria are not something she's gonna wear in this camp, right? So what can you do with this giant amount of jeans that someone like wrote of the tax bill? So we make fabrics and textiles and tapestries that can be used both for storage, but also they are about interpretation of cultural heritage, and this kayamiya, the tents from the region where people learn about their craft. Grandmothers and mothers are involved, so transfer these ideas. But it's also commentary on this kind of global system of exploitation and pollution through the textile industry, which then ends up in these as trash in these camps, in which we are complicit, right? Because it's maybe my t-shirt or my jeans that end up over there. So we are part of that system. And now, I mean, I started working there just because I was first interested in cultural heritage and how can we support these communities in a kind of resilient sense of cultural resilience. But then when I saw, what is the state of humanitarian design, I just couldn't unsee that. It's our moral obligation as human beings, I think, to understand that we need to change radically the way we live and we are in this globe. And my t-shirt is the reason why this person actually lives like they live, right? So it's not now that I'm pretty limited in what I can do, even though you come in from a privileged position. But then I think one can. So now we cannot access the camp. They are shut down. Not even humanitarian aid organizations can access it because of pandemic spread. So it's limited really to like 1-2 people. So the refugees are not only in prison, but are fully left on their own. And it's really interesting to see that actually paradoxically created partly also empowerment models, for example, because they are not patronized. You have these kids who used to be kids now, they're all young men and women getting married. In the meantime, they have taken over and in the camp. They are like the humanitarians. They are leaders of the community because no one can get in. I don't know when we will be able to reconnect. We are in contact on WhatsApp. Everything is, of course, censored and kind of surveilled. But at least we are able to continue working on the documentation and the creation of the book of the inventions that will go out in the world, and we can use time of the pandemic to kind of get that project finished.
Great. I mean, it's so interesting that the work itself is so important. And the issue that you raised in terms of how people who live in these camps are not receiving aid anymore. It's a very dire circumstance, but it's one that's replicated across the world right now. I mean, we can see in countries where we're seeing massive internal displacement still, there are these sort of ongoing effects or added effects that COVID has introduced. And so places like Afghanistan, in places like Somalia, where you have massive numbers of internally displaced people, you know, in other places across the world, Mali, to name a few, the economic situation of people who are internally displaced is already precarious, but because of COVID, they don't have access to even minor jobs that they would have access to, or they don't have the access to humanitarian aid that they formerly had access to. But what you're pointing to is in this camp, you're seeing this real this initiative, this drive to sort of fill that void that's coming from inside, and that's really, it's fascinating. And I hope that
I don't know the extent. You know, this is not studied because it's just a sense that I'm getting, but because they are not supervised anymore, they are finally they got some freedom in the prison. It's amazing.
That's really interesting.
Really, really interesting. And I want to turn to Ranu as well, because I think what Azra is sort of touching on is, obviously there's a shift in the work that you've been doing, Azra, because of these limitations that we have now on travel and so forth. And I think it's a nice transition to Ranu's carpet, in fact, which is a carpet that was designed, Begin, the title of it is Begin. It's a carpet that was designed with various media images of migrating people that are linear images that are sort of overlaid on top of each other on a multicolor background. And it actually requires you to, and trust me, I've done many hours of this, I've logged many hours looking at this carpet at this point. It's at the center of our exhibition gallery, because I think its story is central to what we're talking about. You actually have to look at it for so long to sort of see the images emerged, so you can read what the image is. And I think that it's a beautiful metaphor. It's a poignant metaphor. But I think, again, like Sanctuary, the exhibition itself, it has this added relevance because there's this question of people not being able to travel, to move at all during this time. And I'm wondering if you've thought about your carpet and that design in particular in light of the current circumstances, not the 2016 circumstances.
I don't know if I've thought specifically about that piece of work and how it shifts, but I still think about this situation of being in a country with the southern border and the northern border there's such a different attitude around those borders.
Let me interrupt for 1 second just to explain that the images are actually people from south of the US migrating through the US to get to Canada. Is that correct? Is that
no, they're from people who had come to the United States as refugees.
Yes.
Around the time of the Trump administration's first travel ban. So it was just after the election, and he started putting in these travel bans. And while there was a lot of tension on what was happening on the southern border with people trying to get into the country, and that being that all the problems in the southern border, there were a lot of people who were moving across the northern border, trying to get out of the country because it no longer felt safe here for refugees. They felt like their statuses were not going to become permanent. And for me, that was a loss. Like, I take that as a personal loss, because I feel like what makes this country interesting is the mix of people and the continuous mix of people. And I know that it's what also sort of terrifies the white supremacists, right? Like, there's a real battle going on with that, and it's very palpable, like every day. But for me, the loss of the idea that people feel like this is no longer a sanctuary. I mean, when I was asked to be part of that exhibition, that was kind of what I was thinking about. So, in the current situation, the other part of that carpet, so there's the lines and there's the idea that you mentioned of these images that we have in the news that come and go. for me, like there's this way that I feel like trying to activate a visual surface in a way that makes it that you can eventually understand what you're looking at, but it takes some time. Is sort of, I think that when we look at news images, we assume that we know what we're looking at. And I think that journalism is very important, but that also the kind of cycle of it is really problematic in terms of our deeper understanding of what is happening. And so the idea that, those people are going to create a future wherever they move to, and that they have an autonomy, right? Like what you're saying, Azra, about the people that are in this place that we now can no longer see. I mean, that's a really interesting story for so many reasons. One of which is that it's become invisible at the moment. And so I think, what you're asking about the carpet at the moment is that, this sort of the dimension of it that's about sort of not entirely being able to see, because we're all in our different sanctuaries or wherever we call home, looking at things through a screen most of the time. I mean, that comes up for me. I also think about the background of that carpet is made of all these patterns, and those are patterns that are from different kinds of fabric. And I think about that as something that travels with people, that people bring with it. I also think about the fabric that I use in a lot of my work. It's fabric that comes mostly from India, some of it from Pakistan. And I think a lot about the way that the fabric travels across those borders there, but the people don't. And so that's sort of another element of it, is that the fabric, the pattern, sometimes the objects can travel, whereas the people can't. Mm-hmm. And this sort of sense of the carpet being this object that contains a kind of a history that has a much larger sort of, I think that's I think in your other questions that you were asking about the function of a museum in relationship to an art, is that, when you make an object, you're sort of imbuing it with all of these narratives that are so much bigger than it. And I find it, like a really beguiling and also kind of ironic thing about art objects. But I think that, whoops, my phone, sorry. But yeah, so I think there's something about this, the lack of being able to see clearly, or to take a long time to perceive what's happening. That element of the carpet is something that really applies to the moment.
This resonates to me so much in many levels, what you're saying. I mean, one is the kind of seeing things through screens, right, and images, media, and when you think about all the algorithms that might be right now spying this conversation on Zoom, but also, in our social media, the surveillance capitalism that caters images to us as according to function, that amplifies some of these discrepancies over politics, identity, our opinions on refugees, our maybe indifference to these sites. And on the other hand, what you're saying also with your carpet, the travel of textiles that you're speaking, this is a point in the exhibition. We have this map that is commenting and unpacking the exhibition architecture itself in a gigantic 18-meter long drawing, which traces narratives around the cotton t-shirt, and how that thing, the environmental, the technological and cultural transfers, and where they intersect, and how, historically, I mean, from the kind of history of slavery connected to cotton production, to contemporary monoculture in Uzbekistan, to the, toxic plants and environmental pollution in China and in other places, and then, the kind of exploitation of, let's say, refugee labor in Turkish cotton factories, to then the kind of consumption of these goods and the body images in the high-income countries. And, once you gain weight, you might be throwing away your t-shirt and it gets either shipped back to Sweden to be burned in a power plant, or it will end up in an Indian village where it will be like shredded into something that then becomes the refugee blanket, which then ends up in the Azra refugee camp. And that cycle for me, I mean, when we talk about sustainability, right, and the interconnectedness of all these issues, it's right there, and it's in these materials, in the way whatever we buy, whatever we do, whatever we consume, we profoundly need to rethink everything that we were doing. And I was very excited with talking with the exhibition team, because they were conscious about every moment. It's like, okay, do we print this on paper? No, we are not going to have, we are not going to print text on vinyl. We will have a calligrapher write it on the board and things like this. I think these are some steps, small steps, but steps that we can do as individuals and institutions to start this change, not only in the work we do, but how we do things, how we live things, right?
Yeah, it's really amazing. And also what you're saying requires like a slowing down too. It's like, it's sort of like it feels like a real luxury, the idea of being able to actually produce less.
Mm-hmm. And
that's a really weird condition to be in. I mean, it's actually a luxury in certain ways.
Has COVID given that to you?
COVID, I don't know if it has. I mean, I made a whole body of work that was supposed to be in an exhibition, and now that the exhibition can't really happen in the time frame, we're making a book project instead. So I feel like I'm doing different things, but not necessarily less things. It did slow down some things. Like I was supposed to travel a lot and do a bunch of residencies, and those are all postponed. And it gave me time to sit with with one body of work. But it did give me a lot of time, because I've been sort of focusing on this fabric that I'm printing on. It gave me a lot of time to think about these things with the textiles also. And I mean, it's like fascinating to me to think about also what you were saying about this arch in front of the refugee camp, that like this idea of the cultural sanctuary. I mean, it gave me a lot of time to understand, rather than it making me feel like maybe art was superfluous and something I didn't need. It made me feel like I just don't know what I would do without having this avenue, right? And so, yeah, I don't know. What about you?
Same, actually. I mean, I'm purposely decided to do less things, but it also, what I gained, I think, was really the time and the sense of, I don't know. I mean, I have this all the time. I question, why am I doing what I'm doing, and why is this important, and do I really want to do it? But it did give me a different sense of perspective of like what really matters. So now that I got tenure, I'm also, I don't need to prove anyone anything. It's really, okay, what is it really that you want to do, and why is this important in this world? Right? And I see this and pandemic really as a kind of, for me personally, it was a time of personal growth, totally, in the sense of my own consciousness and kind of meditations and connections with people, and strengthening connections with those who I really care about. But on the other hand, I think it is a chance for us, global community, to arise from it as a kind of stronger, a better group. I hope. I mean, you see traits of both. It's kind of polarized, but I want to be hopeful to see that we will come out of this, and maybe we have to hit the rock bottom and get really, really scared with all these different crises happening simultaneously. But maybe that's the only way that actually we would do something, because otherwise we have all gotten very comfortable the way we have been living. So
I just wanted to thank both of you for such a fascinating conversation that's touched on so many different topics today, but really thinking about how your work, how artistic work, museum work can continue to sort of focus on these issues that were really at the heart of the Sanctuary exhibition that your practices have focused on for a long time, surrounding migration and displacement, but really within this new context where we're confronting an array of issues, most prominently right now, the COVID crisis. And it's been really wonderful to hear both of you offer your perspectives and have been so generous with your time and your knowledge. And thank you so much for sharing your stories with us today.
Thank you for having us.
Great, thank you for having us.
Thank you.